thanks, Frank, and also, you know, thank you for your effort to get this program started here. And it's very exciting to be involved in something in which other people can look at how it's really how it's seen by the kids and the teachers, but how it evolves over time. And as if any of you guys are teachers, you know that, you know, you do all this work, and even as an artist, you do all this work, but you don't really know how it's received or the effect that it has. I'm going to show a few projects and kind of what led me to each one, and over time, starting from the earliest work. My I guess struggle has always been between being an artist and a teacher. I mean, when I was beginning, anyway, that it was a struggle, and then at a certain point, I came to the understanding that really I could be both of those things, and that each one, as an artist, I was a teacher, and as a teacher, I was an artist, and that we make these, you know, divisions between things that are really not very organic or meaningful sometimes. And so when I graduated from high school, actually, is when I first started working with children. And it was because I had just started taking pictures myself, and with a 4x5, and I was really excited about photography. And you know, this was 1969, and it was a time that it was still the 60s, and so there was still experimentation and lots of cool ideas out there. But at the same time, I was going to work on a Native and a First Nations community now in Canada, and no one knew anything about Native Americans. Certainly in this country, it was before Wounded Knee and some different movements, and the AIM movement, which really brought Native American experience to our attention. So I found out that Polaroid was giving grants of cameras and film, and so I wrote my first grant proposal while I was in high school, and was able to get cameras and film to take with me to work in a community I was a day camp volunteer. But what I really saw pretty quickly was that the kids could make pictures, and these were Polaroid, they call them sharpshooters, and they were, you know, black and white, and you know, had some knobs on them to do distance, I think. That the kids could make pictures that were very interesting. And I had my 4x5, and I was shooting, and they were shooting, and together sometimes. And I realized that my pictures were nicely composed, and you know, showed, you know, things that were somewhat romantic, whereas the kids' pictures were much more dynamic. They were shot from different angles, and after looking at them for a while, I began to understand that their pictures were coming, and their compositions were coming out of the land and the experiences that they were having. And as time went on, I began to understand that I really wasn't interested in taking what I had learned as a photographer, you know, in art school, and shooting pictures there. I mean, I had a frame that I was using that had to do with me. And what was really exciting is to see these frames that had to do with them and the people who lived there and the things that they chose. They were much more all over the place and complex than I would have ever thought. So I sort of got hooked at that point, and as soon as I graduated from college, I went to work in Appalachia, in eastern Kentucky, with a group of artists, a cooperative of artists who were from that area. And you know, it was another 60s idea that was part of the war on poverty, and 12 film centers were started throughout the country with the idea that local people would be trained in filmmaking as a job opportunity, but also then they would learn film and they would go to Hollywood and they would change the cultural dynamic of Hollywood. Well, we know that didn't happen, but these people stayed there and decided to make films, have a recording studio, and then I was part of that. I came in and started a photography project. You know, so I thought, well, I guess I could do the same thing I had done earlier in Canada. And so I worked in the Artists in the Schools program, which was another one of these great programs. It's still sort of continuing, where you have artists do residencies in schools. But they had never had one in Eastern Kentucky because you had to come up with a match in order to have an artist in the schools. So I just started doing it myself, and I got money from the Fish and Game Club and the Lions Club and, you know, whatever I could. And eventually the State Arts Council saw what I was doing, and they said, well, you know, can you be an artist in residence even though you can't come up with the, you know, the money to be a match? And so they allowed me to do that for about 5 years, which was a gift to me and I think to the kids, because I was able to work with these kids over a long period of time. And so anyway, the schools I worked with one was a one-room school, the second to last one-room school in Kentucky. Was using Instamatic cameras. The kids were developing their film and printing. We built darkrooms. So this is a picture, obviously by Janet Stallard, called "I Took a Picture of Myself with the Statue in the Backyard." And the first thing I asked them to do was to photograph, to make self-portraits. And I sort of used really these guys to work out my ideas about a kind of curriculum plan. But what I was really interested in was having them make pictures. But in order to, and I wanted to work in a school. I didn't want to work in an after-school program. I wanted to be part of the kids' daily lives as it already existed. And I didn't want this to be an add-on. So, so I had to sell it to the schools. And the way of doing that was to talk about writing and reading and how it affect core curriculum ideas. So writing became an essential part of it. Now let's see if I can do this right. Oh, good. One of the other assignments I developed at that point was to photograph dreams or fantasies. And I came to that with the watching my neighbors and watching the kids and watching them play and realizing, you know, what a wealth of creativity there was in their play, and how as a photographer, how could I access that, or how could they access that? And so rather than saying, oh, why don't you use your imagination and make pictures, I thought, well, what's concrete? And you know, the idea of waking up in the morning with a dream is something that most of us have an experience with. And so we got in our darkroom that we had in the classroom, and in order to create an atmosphere for exchanging and sharing, you know, something that can be, you know, scary or very personal, I would start, and we would all go around the circle and tell dreams. And this is a dream, a picture that Alan made of his dream about Ricky Dixon. And he and Ricky had a fight because they had swapped hunting knives, and you know, it's a rural culture where hunting and you know, guns and knives are part of growing up. And so they each one thought the other one had gotten the best of them. So they were not speaking to each other. So Alan had this dream and then asked Ricky to enact it for him. And then, of course, in the making of the picture, you know, the relationship, you know, got back on track. And so dreams became, you know, a big part of our project together. This is Scott Huff, who did a whole series of this spaceship, and Scott Huff is now an engineer, and he has 2 companies in China. And there is the planes crashing on my head. If you can see that there's 2 like balsa wood planes coming down on him, and this, of course, is, you know, just using whatever they could. And he had his mother taking the pictures, you know, so now I've gotten to know Scott Huff again now, and you know, he's in his mid-40s, and his mother talks about these pictures as the first time that she understood Scott's ambition. And it was a very emotional moment, actually, when she was talking about that. And then we went back, and it's still like that right there. Where he took it. And there he's crashed with a sheet for his parachute. And so also what became clear with these pictures is how intentional they are, and, you know, well crafted. These are not accidents. Here's another self-portrait of Denise Dixon, who is definitely the most talented photographer I've ever worked with. And I was able to work with her for, I think, about 4 years. So this was a substantial part of their growing up, this project. And there she's photographing her doll. And her subjects were her toys, herself, and her twin brothers. And there Philip and Jamie are creatures from outer space in their spaceship. And when these were, I always tell this story, but when these were shown at University of Kentucky, we took a lot of the kids and family, and Denise's mother came, and she was very supportive of Denise's photography and still is. And she stood next to this picture for the opening to tell everybody that her kids really didn't look this way. But Denise was very, you can see from the strips, the contact sheets, that she tried a lot of different things to flatten their faces before she got what she wanted. There's her brother, the mud monster. And one more little story, and then I'll spare you. But recently, I met Denise and her mother again after about 30 years. And we met at the McDonald's in somewhere in Kentucky, in London, Kentucky. And I saw her mother first, and then I saw Denise come out with a guy trailing her. And I thought, oh no, that must be her husband, and maybe he's not going to be so happy about this. And then as soon as I got up to them, the mother said, oh, meet the mud monster. And so this kid was now, you know, a little heavy set and bald, and this mud monster episode was still part of their family lore. So Denise's photographs really sort of predate a lot of, if you know about sort of self-portraiture and acting in the history of, recent history of photography, her photographs have been influential to photographers and predate many of, like Cindy Sherman, you know who she is. There's Dolly Parton, and actually Dolly did write her a letter after we did a book of their photographs, which was really a wonderful experience because we were able to, I was able to bring a book designer and a book editor and really work with them on how books are made so that they were part of that, the process all along. And then here's Denise again with Thanksgiving dinner, just what was essential in the way that she framed things. So I maintain that, you know, we all have a sense of composition, and you know, some people need help in order to realize that, but Denise had it, knew how to handle the camera, and I could always tell which photographs were hers by the composition. There she is. So very assured, and still very assured as a photographer, actually. So that was Kentucky. This is actually jumps long, maybe about 20 years after that, almost, or 15, when I started working in North Carolina, when I started the Literacy Through Photography program at the Center for Documentary Studies. And really, I was first starting at just me working in the schools, but then soon I saw that there were too many schools that wanted to participate, and I was only one person. So I decided to teach a class at Duke so that my students could go in and work with teachers in other classrooms. One of the things that it was interesting. It grew until at one point we were working in 17 schools in Durham, and so it really began to affect the whole school system in a sense. But one of the challenges was that we were asking kids to do things that they wouldn't normally do, like express themselves in the way that they wanted to, present what they did in ways that they wanted to, and it caused some tension in the beginning. And the students my Duke students would put up an exhibition at the school, and one year all but one was taken down because either they weren't used to having handwriting in the hall, or that the subject matter they didn't feel was appropriate. And one of the pictures that was a problem was someone photographing her mother and her boyfriend, as an example, but different stories. And so I realized that I had to start doing teacher training, that it didn't work, you know, to have, you know, these nice Duke students go in and work with the kids, that in order to really make it worthwhile for the school, I had to train the teachers so the teachers could use it in their way. So I started, actually I didn't, I started training teachers in Durham, you know, in service days or whatever. And also I started bringing in African American writers and artists, so that it wasn't just me teaching this, it was people from their own community teaching. And gradually it opened up. And then eventually people started asking me if they could come from other places. So the first year we had one person from out of town, the next year 2, 4, 8, and then, you know, pretty soon we were doing a whole workshop from people from all over the world. But this is a project that I generated out of the work that I did in North Carolina, and it's called Black Self, White Self. And this was a time when there were two school systems that were about to merge, the county and the city. And I don't know what it's like around here, but in very many places this happened where there was white flight, so that the city ended up being African American, and the county predominantly white. And I was working in both, and my students were apprehensive. On each side were apprehensive about this merger. And so before the merger happened, I worked on this project asking kids from both systems to write a self-portrait and then to write another one as if they were a member of the other race. And at that point, there were only pretty much African Americans and whites. Now it's like a whole different situation. So Damien was an African American kid, and so he's, you know, light skin, and he has black hair. His name is Damien. He has 3 sisters, and then he's Brett, I think. Yeah, as a white kid, I'm 11 years old, and I'm the only child. My name is Brent. I like to go swimming and skating. My favorite food is liver. I have brown hair and brown eyes. I love school, and I realize that these are kind of, they're wonderful to read because they're, you know, there's so much cultural significance in the things that they write about, and they're very playful. So that was the beginning of the project, and then I oh, sorry, this isn't the right one. But then oh yeah, it is. So then I asked them to bring clothes so that they could pose as either themselves or a member of the opposite race. So Damien brought his, you know, a Madras shirt. I don't know where he got that from, and the pants and everything, to create Brent. And then I made these pictures with a Polaroid, so that we could check them out and change them, etc. And then it was a big negative, so I gave him the negative to use however he wanted, to add whatever he wanted to it from the writings that he had done. Okay, so these are other examples of this, and Gregory is African American, and then this is what he imagines a white person feels like, and he's used opaquing ink to make these lines on the negative. And you know, this was really a revelation to me and to everybody else who was working on this project. And one of the biggest revelations, which shouldn't have been, was that the African American kids, they really were very comfortable doing this, and they had a language to do it with. And they had a visual language to do it with, whereas for the white kids, it was much harder. They had to. I mean, they're either very fantastical, or in some cases, like in this is a 5th grade class, there were African American kids in that class, so they had to ask the African American kids to help them to pose. And this one of Heather, who's posed reading as white and jump roping as black. I mean, of course, you know, it's part of these stereotypes of, you know, white kids being smart and African American kids being athletic. But this one by Antonio Gunter is really interesting because he imagines himself becoming a doctor. He doesn't wear glasses. He's got black pants. But he imagines himself as white, as a homeless person. And I didn't really understand for a long time, and I kept asking him about it. And he explained to me that he thinks to be white is to be actually without a community, without this enveloping, warm African American community. Now this one I have the text for, which so you can see how the text works. And Xavier says of himself, I am 1, silly, 2, have dark brown hair, 3, I'm scared of snakes, 4, I like dancing and singing, 5, I like to swim, 6, I like track and field, 7, I like to talk on the phone, 8, I like to play with my dog, my favorite team is North Carolina, and my favorite food is pizza. So here is his white self, and why he chose a glass bowl to put on his head, I don't really know. But if I was white, 1, I will change my name to Jonathan on Family Matters. 2, people will call me a saltine. 3, I will be a rock star on stage. 4, I will stay in school. 5, going to funerals will be different. And 6, I would like going to Greek restaurants. So, you know, it's funny, but it's crushing, you know, at the same time. But it sort of gave a space, you know, for the kids to talk about this, and for their teachers to talk about it. And another thing that happened was that this idea about reading. You see, reading only comes up in the white kids. I mean, in the white versions, whether they're white or black. That eventually ended up changing. This is Brandy, a white girl, and it's sort of hard to see it. But in the back there, she's drawn a castle on the playground there. So that she imagines herself as an African-American princess. So eventually, things began to change. I did this for a while. You know, then I finally got this, and you know, I was happy that, you know, someone pushed back and said, you know, no, I don't have to be one or the other. I can think about myself in different ways. This became a project that was, and maybe still is, used by at University of North Carolina in the teacher training program. It was very scary to do. It was scary for me to do. I remember the first time that I showed it to the people at Durham Public Schools, you know, the administration. I was pretty nervous, but in fact, they asked me to do it for the administration of the public school system. So it became useful, and people do it in different ways. Sometimes they, you know, the binary's different. You know, it could be girls or boys or whatever. But the idea of imagining yourself as something opposite. But I also like them as pictures, and I print them really big, and you know, I think they're very, you know, dynamic pictures. And for me as a photographer, it's very interesting to have, you know, something that I've taken, but then that they've, you know, that they've worked on. It pushes the photographic medium for me. So this is a project. Then I also continued to move around, and this is in Saudi Arabia. And I was invited to work with women and girls in Saudi Arabia. And this is a portrait that I took of a woman in my workshop, and she's actually a photographer. So one of the challenges in this work, when I was photographing them, was to make pictures that could be shown publicly. And this, you know, the reason why she's got that camera in front of her face is, I mean, to represent herself as a photographer, but also to obscure part of her face, and then she's scratched on the other part. So I worked with both, as I said, both women and girls, and this is a self-portrait that Nadine did over time. This is only a piece of it. But one of the challenges for this woman was, that she couldn't show her face, so she's brilliantly used this chair with that piece that sticks out. And she's placed objects on the table and is holding books that have to do with parts of her life. So the one on the right is her career as a mother, and the one on the left is her career as an engineer. This is another portrait that a writer, Raja Alem, made, a portrait of her sister and herself. And so she's chosen these shells to represent them. And these are people like the kids. These are all Instamatic, point and shoots. They'd never taken pictures before. They were incredibly, obviously, creative in making these pictures. But there was something very haunting about seeing them make pictures in which they had to, erase themselves. Okay, so this is Raja's self-portrait, and this again is just with a point and shoot, and she's used a mirror, and but when the work was done, and we had an exhibition, I asked Raja, and I'll just read this quickly, to write about this experience. And a piece of what she says is, since the beginning of time, we have had no respite from prying, idolizing eyes. For those of us who live in a culture as ancient as Saudi Arabia's, the historical and spiritual weight of these images suggests that making portraits is no light matter. Taking someone's photograph is equivalent to capturing his twin self, his spirit. It is a way of taking complete control of the person whose picture is taken. Photography is a glimpse into the soul, stolen for the sake of illuminating a dark, impersonal sheet of paper. In this case, photography turned out to be something more. It began when we allowed an outsider to see behind the veil. Then, assuming the role of hunters, put us in another realm and gave us a place to stand that was powerful enough to alter the male-controlled orbits we move in. When we took our cameras into the street, people reacted with sincerity and entertained new possibilities. The bodies they had lived in so long opened to whatever experiences they might encounter. They seemed oblivious to the dangers of intrusion or captivity. They opened up and posed happily, smiling at the camera's charm and at our courage in openly pursuing stories in circumstances that are ordinarily closed. By posing, they allowed us to steal their souls, and in the very act of announcing our power, we women gained power over the men. So I think that this, for me, is a lot about the work that I do, is trying to figure out how to use photography to make power available to people who don't necessarily usually have it. And I think this was a surprise to them, as well as it was to me, that if they took the camera out and they started working, things would change. It's much harder for young girls. She used her uniform to represent herself and her daily life. This is Raja's sister Shadia, who's a painter. And it says, I used to dream my paintings before painting them, but now my painting dreams dreamt me. And so this is I made this photograph, then I gave her the negative, but when she came to be photographed, she drew on herself so that there was already a layer of marking, and then she remarked it once it was taken. So it was really an interesting project and important for them. I think it was the first exhibition by photographs by women in Saudi Arabia. Nadine is using her daughter to represent herself. I asked her to put her hands in, so there was some piece of her. She's able to pose as she does because she is the daughter, she's an El Saud, which means she's a princess. And Joanna is too old to not cover herself, but her little sister is young enough not to be covered. And before I printed this, Joanna asked me to add more scratches to her face, which I did, but it was hard to do. There she is. Versace is on the basil plant, is the plant in the Garden of Eden. So that's a very representative picture of what it means to be a woman, this cross between high fashion and ancient. And then this is Raja holding the book of dreams. And then that's what she's written on there, the Queen of all queens in the Kingdom of Keys. So it's a piece out of the... okay, one more here. A project that I did over a number of years ended up being a book called American Alphabets. And I was, interested in the idea that, we have an idea of teaching materials, the alphabet being one, and they're pretty much all, had been all white-centric. So I wanted to do an alphabet book that combined different alphabets. So this is the Arabic, then I did Spanish in North Carolina, and I did an African American alphabet in Cleveland, and then a white girl's alphabet in Massachusetts. And I asked each of them to, I asked the class to come up with words that they wanted to use to illustrate each letter. So this is Aleph, which is a very important letter in Arabic, and Ahmad is to command, and then I had them write sentences and definitions of each of the word. So I took them with a 4x5 camera and then with backdrops, and then they wrote the letters. We set up the pictures together, and then they wrote the letters. So this is Shin, and the word is Sham, which means to smell. So here they had to really learn a whole lot about color photography, and where that green written on there. I mean, they didn't use a green marker, and I can't remember whether it was what it was now, but we had a whole code of, and so they learned if you write, maybe that might have been purple, a purple marker, and then it turned out green. So there are layers of color, so it was fairly complicated, but something that they really enjoyed doing. Ain, Chain, which in the word is Aima, or blind. And these pictures were taken before Abu Ghraib happened, but you start looking, you realize that you start looking at things differently depending on what's happening in the world. Kaf or Kalela diminish, and this is a very smart kid who was very mathematical and went immediately to the cafeteria, got all these cups to make a diminishing triangle, and then he decided that wasn't really enough, but so that he wanted to diminish the triangle even further by that line that he added. So very creative. Kitab or book. And ham is a big, is an important word in Arabic. This is something that he was sure he wanted to make this picture this way. He brought this, he's from Algeria. These were all made in Queens right after September 11th. This is Cleveland. And this is the first time I shot in color when I did this, because I didn't want it to make it a binary by shooting in black and white, and so that's kind of why that happened. So in order to set this up, I really wanted the kids, as in all these projects, but to feel comfortable using the language that was most familiar to them, whether it was speaking in Arabic or speaking in Spanish, or in this case, how they spoke at home. And so I had them read out loud some different conversations in books by African American writers. And it was very interesting because they'd start off reading it, and then they realized there were words in there that they're not used to reading out loud at school, and kind of a stopping, and then I would say, yeah, go on, yeah. And then they'd really get into it. But it was like they had to be given permission in order to use the language that was their own language. And then we would, they would come up with these ideas, how they wanted to shoot them, how they wanted to shoot the words. They picked the word, and then, then I would bring the props that they wanted, in this case, the Oreos. And then, but, he came with this shirt on so that, he could have him dribbling into the Oreos. But I was not too confident in the first color project I took on, so I shot it in both black and white and color and used whatever I wanted. So he thought of, he wanted those T's like that. I mean, he did them and he thought of them, and also that he wanted to have the word come out of his mouth. And this you have out in the hall, I think. I've seen it around. X's are always a difficult idea, and so he decided he'd just make his body into an X. And then this is Spanish from North Carolina. And this was the first one I did when I understood that the words that they were choosing were very significant, and that it was kind of a community collective portrait. And this is using the word nervous, I thought was very strange, and it didn't seem like a kid-like word. And it took me a little bit of time to think about it. And I mean, this is more likely, querer, to like. But I began to understand that some of the words that they were using had to do with who they are and the fact that they're immigrants, many of them illegal, and that their lives are somewhat precarious. Rascar, to scratch. Whistle. And then we showed these, and an exhibition of these in the school, and which they loved doing because it gave them a chance to share their language, because they were a very small minority at that point, and that the kids, other kids, the Anglo kids, thought when they were speaking in Spanish that they were talking about them, or there was something negative to the language and the situations in which they used it. So this gave them an opportunity to teach the others. And then finally, I worked in the high school that I had gone to with girls who were juniors and seniors. And so it's similar, but the use of language is quite different. Like attitude is her definition, encapsulation of intensity and emotion of the human experience. And the words they chose, of course, were very different. Being older. And I had them read diaries of people who went to the school, a couple of diaries of people who went to the school in the late 1800s, and then we talked about what it means to be a girl now in that environment. So that was kind of the background for them choosing the words and creating the images. And once they read all the words that they had chosen, they said that they realized that they hadn't realized while they were doing it that the words were really about, a lot of them, about vulnerability and sex. And we were actually doing these outside in front of a dorm, and it was in November in Massachusetts, so it was quite a challenge, but it was a lot of fun. So it made me really realize that, you know, something like this very simple idea, you know, you can use at many different levels, either pedagogically or artistically or in the documentary way. So I think I'll let you guys ask questions if you'd like.